What happens when the weight of what isn't yours turns into a fire inside your own mind? You felt that invisible pressure, like your skin's too thin to hold everything you absorb. You walk among people, and without even realizing it, every word, every gesture, every emotion that isn't yours clings to you like invisible dust. You call it empathy, sensitivity, connection, but there comes a point when it stops being a gift and turns into a burden no one else can see, let alone understand. And that day doesn't arrive with an explosion, but with a strange, almost unnoticeable silence. It's not that you wake up thinking you're about to break. It starts with a casual conversation, a glance that lingers just a bit too long, a word that hits a nerve you didn't know was exposed. And without warning, something inside you switches on, an old echo, a shadow that's been waiting all along. Jung would call it an unconscious constellation, that moment when a part of your psyche you've kept under control grabs the wheel. You're no longer fully you, you're the sum of every emotion you've carried, every wound you've taken on as your own. At first, you try to fight it. You tell yourself you're just tired, that you just need a few minutes to get your balance back. But what's happening to you doesn't go away with rest. You feel your awareness, the voice that organizes and filters the world, start to slip, as if you're watching it drift away from the inside. What's left is something else, darker, more primal, something that doesn't bargain or reason. It's not pure anger, not pure sadness. It's both, multiplied by everything you've been absorbing for years. The people around you don't notice the change right away. You keep talking, moving, even smiling. But inside, the landscape's different. There's a constant background noise, an emotional hum that never shuts off. You try to trace where it's coming from, but you realize it has no single source. It's everything at once. It's the build-up from every time you listened without answering, every time you held back someone else's tears instead of your own, every time you said, "I'm fine," while your own cracks were splitting open. In that state, perception twists. Small gestures feel like threats, neutral words sound like judgment, and silence turns into an abyss. Jung would call this the shadow, everything you've rejected in yourself, and by not integrating it, it comes back stronger to take center stage. The painful part is that your shadow isn't made only of your forgotten pieces. It's also filled with fragments from all the people you've absorbed. It's not just your shadow, it's the shadow of a whole chorus of voices that don't belong to you, but live inside you. You don't choose to lose your mind, not consciously. It's more like your mind decides to let go on its own. A surrender. The you know steps aside, and what's left is raw, unfiltered force, unable to measure consequences. It might show up as an outburst of anger that shocks everyone, or as an icy silence that severs any connection. The mask falls, and with it, the version of you that knew how to soften the world enough to survive it. And now you're here with no filters. Everything that comes and passes straight through you, walls feel like smoke. There's no way to pace it, no place to hide. The sensitivity that once gave you sharp insight turns into a flood that wipes everything out. It's like you've opened a one-way floodgate, and the water that's been building for years finally breaks through. The real question isn't just what happens in that moment, but who you are afterward. Because the instant your mind gives way, something shifts forever. Some people never come back completely, others return, but with a different gaze, as if they've seen a landscape that can't be unseen. Either way, what was once invisible is now clear. You have a limit, and you've found it. You might think that's a tragedy, and in some ways it is. But it can also be a revelation. Jung believed those breaking points are portals, chances to see the inner forces that usually stay hidden. Of course, seeing them doesn't mean you understand them, and understanding them doesn't mean you can control them. But ignoring them? That guarantees they'll return one day, maybe stronger. So here you are, standing in the exact spot where everything you've been and everything you never wanted to be exist inside the same body. There's no manual for this. Nobody prepared you for what it feels like when your own psyche pushes against the edges of what you thought was stable. All you know is that you can't keep carrying the world without first carrying yourself. That's the real danger for the empath, not other people's cruelty, but your own neglect. And when that neglect shatters all at once, the impact is unlike anything you've ever experienced. It shakes you, empties you, and at the same time, shows you brutally and clearly what you've been all along, a vessel overflowing with other people's stories to the point of forgetting your own. And now that you're here, in this unrepeatable moment, the question is inevitable. Will you let that shadow consume you, or will you look it in the eye and claim what was always yours? The moment the mind breaks isn't some sudden ending. It's the result of thousands of invisible microfractures. Every time you bit your tongue to keep from making someone uncomfortable, every time you absorbed someone else's pain without processing it, every time you chose to put others ahead of yourself, that's when the erosion began. For years, your psyche learned to carry loads it was never meant to bear, as if it were natural. It wasn't. It only felt natural because it became habit. Empathy, when it's not balanced with a solid sense of self, is dangerous ground. Jung warned that any function of the psyche, taken to the extreme, no matter how virtuous it may seem, can become its opposite. What began as sensitivity turns into extreme vulnerability. What began as connection becomes emotional invasion. What began as deep listening turns into a black hole that swallows everything it touches. Without boundaries, the line between what's yours and what's theirs blurs until you no longer know where you end and the other begins. That breaking point isn't just losing your mind the way an outsider might see it. It's more accurate to say that your consciousness, exhausted, stops standing guard and lets the repressed flood in. Jung would call it an eruption of the unconscious, a phenomenon that can show up as a crisis, as depersonalization, or even as a kind of emotional trance. The most unsettling part is that, in that state, the emotions aren't just yours. They're mixed with fragments of other people, echoes you picked up without realizing it. That's why the intensity feels so out of proportion. You're not processing a single story, but a chorus of overlapping ones inside you. In that altered mental space, your sense of time warps. Memories flare back to life as if they're happening right now. Emotions resurface with the same force they had the first time you felt them. The mind, which had been working to keep things in order, decides it no longer has the energy to keep containing. And what spills out doesn't distinguish between past and present, yours and someone else's. It all feels immediate. It all burns. You might try to isolate yourself, thinking solitude will be enough to sort out the chaos. But isolation only amplifies the inner voices. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow comes in. Everything you've denied about yourself, plus everything you've absorbed from others and never released. The shadow isn't pure evil. It's unrecognized potential, unintegrated emotions, truths that made you uncomfortable. When the shadow takes over, it's not trying to destroy you for no reason. It's acting out because you never gave it another way to be heard. This confrontation with the shadow is brutal precisely because you can't bargain with it. It doesn't take excuses, it doesn't get distracted by pretty words. It shows you, straight up, what you didn't want to see. The built-up rage, the resentment from years of emotional overextension, the fear of rejection if you stop pleasing people. And the more you fight that revelation, the more violently the overflow hits. Your body reacts, shallow breathing, tense muscles, a heartbeat that feels like it's pounding from the inside. Your whole nervous system goes on high alert, as if you're facing an external threat, but the real enemy is inside and you can't run from it. In this state, your interactions with others change. Some back away, unsettled by your intensity. Others try to fix you with canned phrases that only deepen the sense of being misunderstood. And that's when you uncover another uncomfortable truth. A lot of people only valued your empathy when it served them. When you stop being that unconditional safe harbor, when you set boundaries, the connection cracks. Losing that hurts, but it's also a cleansing. Little by little, in the middle of the storm, something starts to come into focus. This collapse isn't just punishment, it's also an opening. The eruption of the unconscious, as terrifying as it is, carries a map, signs of what you've ignored, of needs you've put off, of emotions that need acknowledgement and processing. The challenge is finding the courage to look at that map instead of tearing it apart. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean justifying everything that comes up in this state. It means recognizing that every reaction has a root. Rage signals a boundary that was crossed. Sadness reveals a grief you never processed. Exhaustion shows a debt you owe yourself. By giving these feelings a conscious place, you slowly regain the control you thought you'd lost. Not because the storm vanishes, but because you learn how to navigate it. But navigating it requires something that, for an empath, can feel almost impossible: putting yourself first. Setting a boundary isn't selfish, it's survival. Learning to hand back the burdens that aren't yours is the only way to keep this collapse from happening again. Jung would say this is the point where individuation, the process of becoming a whole, autonomous being, becomes urgent. You can't just keep being everyone else's mirror, you need to be your own reflection too. This process isn't a straight line. There will be setbacks, days when you take on more than you can handle, moments when the shadow tries to take back control. But every time you spot the signs before it's too late, you strengthen that part of you that once seemed fragile. Over time, empathy stops being an open channel without filters and becomes a conscious choice. The world no longer decides how much you feel, you decide how much you receive and how much you hold on to. The day you lose your mind doesn't have to mark the beginning of the end. It can be the start of a stronger, freer way of existing. You won't go back to who you were, and that's the real victory, leaving behind the version of you who was quietly burning out to make space for someone who finally belongs to themselves. When chaos finally burns out, it doesn't slam the door, it exhales. The silence it leaves behind isn't pure emptiness, but a different kind of space, like the room of your mind has been cleared out after a storm that swept away everything you didn't really need. And there, in that quiet, you start seeing yourself without the costumes you once wore just to survive. There's no urge to impress, no need to please, no weight of carrying someone else's burdens. For the first time in a long time, you're standing center stage in your own life. That moment is unsettling. For years, you thought you were your empathy, as if your worth was measured by how deeply you could feel for others. Now you understand that was only a part of you, not the whole. The rest had been buried under layers of self-imposed emotional obligations, under the belief that your mission was to protect everyone, even if it meant betraying yourself. Realizing you can be more than a shelter for others is freeing, but it's also terrifying. Because if you're not only that protector, then who are you? There are no quick answers. What you have now is open territory, land that used to be tangled up in the weeds of other people's expectations. Walking through it takes patience and a different kind of courage, the courage to face yourself with no escape routes. Each step uncovers corners you'd ignored, sleeping passions, firm boundaries, needs you've kept on the back burner. It's not a clean or perfect process, but it's real. And that alone makes it priceless. Along the way, you learn that your sensitivity doesn't have to be an open wound to be genuine. You can feel deeply without becoming the container for everyone else's pain. You start noticing when a feeling that hits you doesn't actually belong to you, and with that awareness comes the freedom to send it back to where it came from, without guilt. That's not indifference, it's self-respect. Jung spoke of integration as the act of pulling together the scattered pieces of yourself, recognizing both light and shadow so neither has to dominate by force. For you, integrating means accepting that your shadow is made of everything you denied. Your anger, your exhaustion, your need for rest. But it's also made of your strength, your intuition, your ability to stand on your own when no one else can hold you up. Denying that side would only drag you back into the same cycle that led to the breakdown. Accepting it is the only way your empathy and your identity can coexist without destroying each other. You begin to notice small but meaningful changes. The way you say no without feeling the need to explain every detail. How you step out of a conversation the moment you feel your boundaries thinning. The way you allow yourself to feel joy without the compulsion to share it with the whole world. These might seem small to others, but for you, they're milestones. Proof that you haven't slipped back into who you were before you lost your mind. Some people won't understand your transformation. A few will drift away, uncomfortable with your new firmness. Others will try to pull you back into the role you used to play. Not everyone can handle the version of you that no longer bends out of fear of disappointing them. And while that loss can sting, it's also a natural pruning. The relationships that survive are the ones that see all of you, not just your emotional usefulness. As you move forward, you realize that the day you broke wasn't an anomaly, it was the inevitable result of an unsustainable pattern. If you'd never hit that limit, you might have spent your whole life believing your purpose was to absorb other people's pain until you disappeared. Paradoxically, it was that collapse that brought you back to yourself. What once felt like total loss has become a point of origin. This rebirth isn't a permanent state of calm, it's a different way of living your days. You know the shadow will always be there, that the old habits of emotional overload will try to creep back, that there will be moments when your empathy spills over. But now you have tools you didn't have before, the awareness of your limits, the ability to recognize when something isn't yours to carry, and the resolve never to become a bottomless container again. You look back at the version of yourself who thought strength meant enduring everything. Now you understand that real strength is choosing which loads to carry and which to leave behind. It's not an impenetrable armor, but a balance between openness and protection. The empathy you still hold is purer now, because it's no longer tangled up with blind sacrifice. You can meet someone's eyes and be fully present without losing yourself in their story. You can hear pain without making it your home. In the end, what brought you here wasn't the breakdown itself, it was what you chose to do after. You could have stayed in resentment, in the victim role, in the nostalgia for a self that no longer exists. Instead, you chose to use that fracture as a doorway into deeper understanding. And in that journey, you uncovered something that had always been there, waiting, the truth that your identity isn't defined by how much you can carry, but by how you choose to live with yourself. That day you lost it, what you really lost were the invisible chains that kept you in a role that was never fully yours. What you gained was something priceless. The right to exist without asking permission, to feel without drowning, to care without destroying yourself in the process. And while you can't erase what happened, you might not even want to, because now you know that sometimes, collapse isn't the end, it's the most honest way to start again.